Minutes to start.
We'll be able to see. Unless you're doing the intro.
Live now.
We are.
Okay, good morning. Welcome to the weekend. We're really excited today to have Scott Orr with us from Fidelity. Back at the beginning of the year, we laid out a schedule, of important events for the year, and have tried to get some good thematic topics. And one of the most important ones, Scott, this year was the election. Of course, that was pre-pandemic, and which has shaped a lot of things, including some of the news or lack thereof around the election. But well, we're hot in the middle of election season now. And we're finally starting to see some things about candidates, and we're really glad to have Scott here. Scott's got an interesting background and perspective. One, he's grown up in our region. He's a guy originally from Texas, but went to Harvard and was a portfolio manager originally with Fidelity, where he spent 2 decades and managed $11 billion in fixed income. So, we get all kinds of questions now about, literally on a daily basis, about what the impact of the election is going to be on markets. And so, and we anticipated this, having been here for the last one, and it's just interesting times. And I guess you've got some great stuff to share with us today, and we're looking forward to hearing your comments about the election and your perspective. Scott, why don't you share a little bit about what your role is now with Fidelity, with their government affairs, and your involvement in that area?
Absolutely. So I'm the Vice President of Public Affairs and Government Relations with Fidelity. I'm actually based in the Dallas area. We have a huge office, about 6,000, up in Westlake, which is the Dallas Westlake, the town of Westlake, right. In the Dallas-Fort Worth area. But we have a very large campus there with 6,000 people. A lot of our national operations are actually based here in Texas. And the way Fidelity operates our group is that we have a team in D.C., of course, at all times in Washington, D.C., that is, in a typical time, would be on Capitol Hill every day, speaking with members and walking the halls of Congress. And again, typically I would be there probably every 6 weeks or so, doing the same thing, because there's a tag team approach. They're there all the time, but we also want to have people where we have a significant presence to really, drive home those relationships. So I have very strong relationships with our Senator Cruz, Senator Cornyn, with our members of the House here in the Texas region, some especially up in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, that we have lots of constituents that work for us, but also those, that are in key positions throughout the state. And I also kind of cover other states kind of up through the Midwest as well. But, it's one of those things, we are in touch on a daily basis. We are constantly in contact, and we're working for issues that impact investors and retirement savings. And it's rare that we are out lobbying for something that's good for Fidelity per se. It's really what's good for the markets and what's good to help close the retirement gap and things like that. So that's what we tend to operate with and work on. And it's a model that works very well. So we really enjoy that. And again, it's good because I get a lot more time with some of these members, like Congressman Veazey or Congressman Allred up in Dallas, than you would if you were up in DC trying to meet with them in their offices. So it's a program that works very well.
Sure. Well, okay. Well, great. Well, I know you have some great comments today and observations, and why don't we go ahead and kick it off and let you take us through some of your thoughts on what's going on today with the election.
Sounds good.
I would encourage anybody to ask questions as you have them. We're accumulating the questions. We'll take a couple breaks along the way and get right to those.
Thanks, Chris.
Again, thanks for having me here today. And make sure, I think there we go. We are what I just sort of covered. Our group within Fidelity is communications, public affairs, and policy. And so we have the federal team. We have a team that really all they do is come up with our policy issues and make sure that we're dealing with that. Fidelity is definitely one of the most active investment managers on the Hill. We have our colleagues and our competitors that we work with on some issues, but we really are seen as the thought leaders and the go-to. And as I've said about the relationships, to me, my My best moment is when I hear directly from a legislative director or a member of Congress himself saying, hey, Scott, this just came across our desk. What do you think? What does Fidelity think? What is the impact going to be? So that's our goal, is to have that kind of relationship. Let's jump right into the political landscape, because that's very important about where we are right now as a country. I think this slide shows this pretty well. This is basically looking at the approval of the president by the different parties all the way back to Eisenhower, and how that gap has changed. So all the way back in Eisenhower's age, the bottom of the page here, 87% of Republicans approved of the job that President Eisenhower is doing, and 56% of Democrats approved. And you see that it's a fairly narrow range all the way up through Nixon, Ford, Carter, Reagan. Gets a little bit wider during the Clinton years, widens again during the Obama years, and of course it's the widest it's ever been now in the Trump years. 88% of Republicans still, and this is information that's still very true, that if you ask Republicans if they approve the job he's doing, maybe not himself as a person, but approve the job he's doing and his policies, 88% of Republicans say they approve. Only 8% of Democrats say they approve. Lowest it's ever been in, again, as long as it's been recorded. And honestly, I don't know who those 8 Democrats are, because I've never met a Democrat that is a fan of President Trump. So he is a very polarizing president. It's part of his modus operandi. I think he enjoys fanning the flames. He enjoys getting out there and mixing it up. And he's been successful in many ways because it's solidified his base. But in other ways, it makes him vulnerable because there's such a strong sense on the other side against him. And we are in different camps. I think everyone, as probably everyone on this call, I assume is on both ends of the spectrum. And we tend to, we're in our tribes, we're in our groups, and not only do we want us to win, we want the other side to be decimated. And it's kind of a Texas OU thing, it's like the last thing that a Texas fan wanted to see OU win the national championship. Anybody but OU, right? So,
Right.
And vice versa. So it is one of those situations where, I think the same thing when it comes to Republicans and Democrats right now is not only do you want your side to be victorious, but you really want to see the other side hurt. So that pervades so much of what happens in Washington right now. And the reason we kind of bring that up, because it really does impact where we stand. And one of the questions people ask, I don't spend a lot of time on this, but why is this so? And part of it really is that I think the very interesting survey and study that Pew Research did earlier this year that said that about 67% of us, 2/3 of us, primarily get our information from news sources that reinforce our point of view. So with the prevalence of cable news, if you're conservative, you watch Fox and you can't stand to watch CNN or MSNBC. And if you're progressive, you watch CNN or MSNBC and can't stand to watch a minute of Fox. And all the blogs and all the different groups are along those lines. So it is part of what we're all in echo chambers, and we tend to hear what we want to hear, and we tend to not want to hear news that doesn't comport to that. And that's another thing that seems to be reinforcing it. And again, this interesting about this, they interviewed about 3,000 people, and they asked them to place all of these groups on the spectrum from liberal to more conservative. And as you can see, according to the average U.S. adult there in the middle, all the mainstream media is to the left. Doesn't mean they necessarily are. I'm not saying that's an automatic scientific fact, but there is perception of the average U.S. adult that all of the mainstream media is to the left of that, including the Wall Street Journal. And, of course, you would expect to see New York Times and Washington Post there. But a lot of that's also driven by subscriber models. The fact that so much now of these journalists and these newspaper outlets are driven by how many subscribers they have. And they know that if they say things that annoy their subscribers in this current environment, that they're going to lose subscribers. And that does impact. And we've seen some of that in the New York Times recently, some of the turmoil they've had in their editorial page. So this is partly why we are where we are as well, is because we tend to reinforce not only from the candidates and from Trump, but also from the media. And one of the things caveat I always make in all this is my goal today is to share with you the conversations and some of the information that we've gathered in our conversations with our members of Congress. And I'm on a weekly basis speaking to different members. And my goal is not to be Fox or MSNBC today. I really want to give you kind of just the unvarnished, unbiased observations that we have. And as a result, I'll probably make everybody mad at some point on the call today, because I'll say something that everyone doesn't like, depending on which side. I tend to be equally critical of both parties these days. So let's just, again, remind ourselves where we are right now. We have a House that is controlled by the Democrats, 232 to 198, with Speaker Pelosi in charge there. And as you know, in 2018, that flipped. So the Republicans had control up through 2018, and then 40 seats flipped from red to blue. And that's important to talk about, because there are, again, 40 seats that were previously, less than 2 years ago, Republican seats that are now Democratic seats. So they do have the majority. It's not a huge majority, but they do have the majority. And in the House, it's like a dictatorship. When you have majority, you rule everything. You determine, it's a majority rule. You can pass things by one vote. And nobody, it's even things like where you sit up on the dais in the front of the hearing rooms. It's based on the party, who's in control, who the chair people are, what the investigations are, all those things, what the hearings talk about, which is why the impeachment happened. Honestly, we'll talk about that in a minute. But the fact that you had a Democratic House and a Republican president would not have happened otherwise if you didn't have opposing parties in charge. So that is one factor that's really impacting things the last 2 years. On the Senate side, of course, it's still controlled by the Republicans. And in fact, they increased their majority by a seat or two in 2018. But as we will be discussing, they're the ones that are defending a lot more ground going into the next election. So I mean, I'm going to make sure we talk about this a little bit later on when it comes down to control of Congress. But that there is balance right now, and things that get passed in the House don't get even taken up in the Senate, and vice versa. And it's why you see so many issues that they can agree upon. Now, one thing I will say, and again, partly of why we talked about the climate going in, is all of these members know that basically their populations, their constituents are divided as well. If they're a heavily Democratic or Republican district, they know they absolutely can't go against that. And one thing that maybe is obvious to say, but elected officials want to be reelected. I mean, I can't stress that enough. It is pervasive in every conversation you have with them. They don't always say it directly, but so often they're out there saying, I can't vote for this because I'll have a primary opponent and I might lose, next spring. And if that's the case, when they're talking, when they're going to a primary season, that's going to impact how they vote. And we need to know that. When I go into someone's office, and I work with both Republicans and Democrats, I need to know that, how likely are they to like what we're talking about today, and how is it going to impact how their party feels about it. So again, just a quickie, what I'm just saying is the Republicans are very united right now. They all know that Trump is who is the figurehead of their party, and in what he says goes, basically, when it comes down to it. And so you have Mitch McConnell, who is going along with the White House pretty much in lockstep, and it's rare that you're going to see any kind of disagreements there. And Republicans have been fairly remarkably consistently together on most things, and even within the Senate, which tends to have a little more variation between some of the members, they are staying together on a lot of the policies and a lot of the bills that they're trying to pass. Democrats are united right now. Again, that's an important stand made, is that Speaker Pelosi has a more difficult job than McConnell does, because she does have a party that is very different. And so you have the bottom of the page here, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, kind of the emblematic of the new progressive Democrats that have been hired recently. You hear about the squad, and really, if you watch cable news, you would think that the squad was leading the Democrats off the cliff to the left. It's just totally progressive. All these things are going to happen. Disaster is going to ensue if they're in control. And the reality, though, is if you look to the right side, those two individuals there. So you have Colin Orr right on top. He is a Democrat from Dallas that I talked to very frequently, that recently 2 years ago beat Pete Sessions. And then you have McAdams there right below him, Ben McAdams from Salt Lake City. And he's a Democrat that beat Mia Love 2 years ago. So those are two very moderate Democrats, and there's lots of those. And that's so important to talk about, because they're kind of at war with each other. And right now, they're not talking much about those wars, but there have always been bad feelings in the last 2 years over the degree to which, what's in the bills that the House has been passing. And they've had to come to compromise, and that's really annoyed a lot of the more progressive members in many ways. And just to kind of think about it, not to go too deep into all this, but when you look at the Democrats themselves, you have the new Democratic coalition. So actually the largest coalition is that kind of more moderate, more paying attention to fiscal responsibility, pro-economic growth, pro-business, pro-innovation. That's the group that's represented by people like the Colin Orr Reds and those that are kind of in those more purple districts, or those that were previously red. Then you have, of course, the Congressional Progressive Caucus, which is also very large, which is all of the Alexandria Ocasio-Cortezes and all of those that are definitely leaning toward, we need radical change, we need really big differences, we need Medicaid for all, we need living wage, we need climate change. All those things are very big parts of their agenda. And again, those don't always go well together. You have the Congressional Black Caucus, very, very powerful as well, which tends to be a little more pragmatic, but is very engaged. And their members are parts of those others. These are not all exclusive groups. But and then you have your more conservative blue dog Democrats who are probably the most conservative, and there's fewer and fewer of those. They're being picked off one by one in many cases by folks like Congressional Progressive Caucus, who isn't afraid to support, primary opponents that are more along the lines. They've had some success doing that. And then there's one interesting group called the Bipartisan Problem Solvers Caucus. It really is a group that's trying to find agreement. So the only reason I bring all this up is if we do see down the line, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, that Democrats have the House, the Senate, and the White House, a lot of this is going to come to the fore a lot more. And the same parallel you think about a couple of years ago when the House was controlled by the Republicans. Remember the Freedom Caucus, which you don't hear about much anymore, but you had the older conservative Republican group that was a Freedom Caucus, and they were large enough to disrupt what the broader Republican caucus wanted to do. So when you had, Speaker Ryan trying to get bills passed that Republicans should be able to pass because they had the majority, they were often blocking those bills internally because they didn't feel like that they were appropriately conservative. And so there's the same reality is going to happen on the Democratic side if they have more control going forward.
So I want to interject a question there because I think probably the biggest question that we hear, and I think you pointed to this with the position of the media, they would let you believe that everything is going off the cliff to the left if the Democrats take charge. And this looks like there's somewhat of balance within the party. And we were talking earlier about, even if the election ends up being a change in Washington, the biggest question we get is, how do we position for it? And what's that going to be the impact? And all these things are going to be bad. But the reality is there's some accountability. You've mentioned, political accountability for people coming for re-election. And then we talked a little bit about economic accountability. But it looks like here that would you say there was balance there?
There's some balance, and again, it is always kind of shifting. And again, once something happens, again, if they do have more power, you may see some of this dynamic change somewhat. But there are things they all agree on too, though, that Republicans don't agree on. So even these conservative or more moderate members of the Democratic Party, they still have some beliefs about, again, unwinding the Tax Cuts Act. We'll talk about that a little bit later.
Sure. Yeah.
So again, I'm just going to touch on this very briefly. Impeachment is a distant memory, even though it was only 7 months ago that President Trump was acquitted by the Senate and was not removed from office. Just the only reason I talk about this is it's still undercurrent, especially when you're in D.C. This was something that was very polarizing, and both sides were locked into what they had to do. Democrats, they knew 84% of their base wanted the president removed. Only 8% of Republicans wanted the president removed. So if you're a Republican, you're not about to go and vote for impeachment or vote for removal. And if you're a Democrat, you're not about to vote against it. The key was that black line there in the middle. You see the independents, they really stayed remarkably stable all the way back to October. And they were just hoping right there, the dotted line is when the actual vote to impeach happened and the hearing started. And Adam Schiff and all the things that you were hearing about and watching on the news, they were hoping that black line would move up and show that a majority of independents believe that he should be removed, and it never happened. And so again, people that are the more moderate members, even though they voted for impeachment on the Democratic side, they are really glad this is no longer a part of the focus. And if you think about it, if you watch the Democratic National Convention, I don't think impeachment was mentioned once, and that's remarkable that they didn't talk about it, partly because you have Clinton on stage with you sometimes, you're on screen, and he was impeached. But I think it was much more the fact that they know this is not a winning hand for them. And it's no longer part of kind of gathering or trying to woo some Republicans over to their side, which is really what the Democrats need, in this case against President Trump. So this is suddenly, off the charts as far as what people are talking about. Republicans talk about it more than Democrats do, just out of that, because they know the same thing, that there were some irritants among independents. They felt like it was overreach. So again, it's still a specter out there, even though it's ancient history. Again, I won't spend a lot of time on the CARES Act. It's almost old news as well, but this was one place it was very remarkable that Congress came together very quickly and got this bill passed when we hit the skids because of the COVID-19 shutdowns. And when the economy really just went into the ditch or was going into the ditch, Congress did come together and realize they had to do something. And yes, the initial, there was some contention initially as they started putting everything together, but this was one of the largest bills in history ever passed. I talked to a lot of members, both Republican and Democrat, but primarily Republican, that say, if you had told me, 6 months ago, I'm going to vote for a $2.3 trillion bill that's all going to be added to the deficit, I'd say you're crazy. But they also agreed, it was almost unanimous that it was passed, that you have to do something, and there had to be something. And I think virtually every economist you talk to says that you were trying to avert a depression, basically. And so to do this, you had to spend this money, you had to get going. And so this first round passed relatively easily, just because both sides agreed to leave things off the table that they knew were going to be controversial to the other side, and that ended up happening, you know. So now we have round two, which is not going anywhere right now. And part of the reason is you look at both sides, and I won't go in detail about all of this, but about the only thing they both agree on in their initial package that was passed, the HEALS Act on the Republican side, the HEROES Act on the Democrats. I don't know how many staffers get put on putting together these acronyms. You know, has to be something snappy every time. But you know, really about the only thing we agreed upon was $1,200 and another round of stimulus for people that make under a certain amount of money. That's virtually the only thing they agree upon in these bills. And certain things, like again on the House side, on the Democratic side, you know, one of their key things, they hate the cap on state and local taxes. And a lot of people on this call hate that too. I mean, I know a lot of us, you know, in Texas, even though it's supposedly a low tax state, you know, a lot of us have high property taxes, and when you have a cap of 10,000, that's always been just the biggest irritant on Democrats, because they felt it was a direct shot at blue states when the Tax Cuts Act was passed. So their number one goal in anything is to get that cap removed so that people can fully deduct their state and local taxes on their federal tax returns. And even though it had nothing to do with COVID, when you think about it, I mean, you can maybe make an argument somewhere that there's some ancillary benefit, but for the bottom line is that that's in there, and that's something Republicans are never going to vote for. There's other things in here, but on the Republican side, they want this shield for employers from liability, and that's one of the things that Democrats are very hesitant to go too far deep into. They agree there shouldn't be frivolous lawsuits, but they feel like what are being proposed is going to limit the ability of consumers or individuals to be able to, you know, get some benefit or some justice if they catch COVID from their employer or somewhere else. So again, a lot of right now is out here. So much on this list is not in agreement, and that's why nothing's happening. And the Senate is getting ready to pass, or trying to pass, a much skinnier version, about half the size, you know, of about a $500 million bill that would really just hit the basics. And Democrats in the Senate blocked it. So there's right now, because of the filibuster, they didn't have 60 votes to pass this super skinny version of it. And of course, the House would be taking it up anyway. So I don't know. I kept thinking that because of things like the extra unemployment rates, unemployment benefits that were being proposed, that you would see you know, some progress made. But right now, they're both dug in. And Nancy Pelosi, especially Speaker Pelosi, was very direct, more direct than usual, when she said about 2 weeks ago to her caucus, I'm not going to pass that smaller bill because we won't have any leverage to get the things we want. You know, and that's always implicit in these things. It's implicit there, but rarely do you have it said that openly. So, you know, both sides are arguing and feel fairly confident that if nothing happens, the other side will get blamed. And that's kind of what the bet they're making right now. And there are some things that have to happen by the end of the month to keep the government going. Continuing resolution, you know, there will be a government shutdown on September 30, which I don't think will happen, but they have to pass some continuing resolutions. And there's some thought that some of this might get added on. But again, the current philosophies right now are keeping that from happening. So it's just fascinating to watch how this is playing out. And even when there's an emergency, that right now they're not finding ways to agree. Well, part of what it is how big the package was and how much still hasn't been spent. So as of really just, you know, earlier, you know, last week, there's still over $1 trillion that hasn't been spent of that CARES Act. And that's partly what the Republicans are pointing to. It's like, we haven't spent all this money yet. Why are we spending another $3 trillion? We need to think about what we've already done so far and what we still can do. Again, the Federal Reserve has a lot of ability to do that. You know, as you can see, they've only done a small portion of all the different types of things, the actions they can take to help boost the economy and you know, keep liquidity in the market. So this is, again, part of the reason why you're seeing some of that. But again, what scares some members, and it's not being talked about much, but just the fact is right now we're estimated to have about a $3 trillion deficit this year, which is just astronomical. And part of the problem is that we started with almost $1 trillion deficit even before COVID hit. And again, that is a fault of Republicans in many ways. And I would say, you know, they cloak themselves in fiscal responsibility, but the Tax Cut Act was supposed to be you know, revenue neutral. Is not. There was only going to be revenue neutral if the economy grew at a 4% rate, and it hasn't. And so the mere fact that that added $400 to $500 billion even in the current year is going to add much more in future years. We were already in a spot where we had a very significant deficit going into this, and now, of course, it is just off the charts. We've never even been close to that. So when you get up to that very high number that we're looking at right now, we're going to really have to think about what does that mean. And again, it's not just this next year; it really is going to have continuing impacts going forward. There's a couple lines here based on what happens next, but this is even before the next round gets passed.
Let me ask you a question about this, because this comes up a lot on these conversations that we're having with people right now, and there's a lot of them around a change in the tax regime, and can you really implement these big stimulus programs and then implement aggressive taxes in this environment?
I mean, right now they're not worried about the deficit, bottom line, and there are enough economists that are giving them cover to say, you still have to do more. And the Fed, I mean, I talked to the Fed president in Dallas, Rob Kaplan, all the time, and he based the same way. He's a pretty conservative economist and someone who believes that, that there should be a balanced budget even, and he's saying we still are not out of the woods yet. So he believes additional stimulus should happen. The question is what happens after. And there's really not many of the House or the Senate that are coming out right now saying that we're worried about it, or that they're worried about it, but what are they going to do about it? And I would say the one good sign is that there was a recent letter that was signed by 30 Republicans, 30 Democrats in the House that basically said we want budget reform. Once we get over this crisis, let's make sure we're building in, even in this bill, let's build in some level of accountability. And at some point we have to come together and figure this out. Because again, we can't continue this, because this is where it goes. It's all in the federal debt. This is not, what's happening is every time, every bit of money that we need to put these programs in place is added to the federal debt. We're going to be at 100% this year of GDP, which again, it's only happened once in the history of the United States, all the way back in World War II, and that was for about a year. And we're on a path right now that for the next 20, 30 years, we're going to be well above 100% of GDP in our debt. And I don't believe it's sustainable. And, some economists say we're in a new world and interest rates are low and what's the big deal? But I just, there's just a lot of impacts of what that is. And partly it's because, again, this is just another look at that going all the way back to 1945, where we are at debt levels, and again, where we're going by 2040 if we don't change our current trajectory. But again, the other big piece of this is all being held by the Federal Reserve. Virtually every bit of the new debt that's being issued, not dollar for dollar. I mean, it's not they issue it and they buy it right up, but whatever is in the market, they're buying securities, they're buying things out of the market. So if you look at where the current balance sheet is for the Fed, it's well over $8 trillion now, which is again multiple sides, and that's direct impact on monetary.
Yeah, I guess my question.
All that. Yeah.
I guess my question around this is again, it's politics aside, regardless of how the election goes, you can't. I mean, you're talking about all this stimulus that's needed, and they're trying to spend $3 trillion on one side, and $1 trillion. I mean, these numbers are crazy. But the fact is, if that much stimulus is needed, how do you saddle the economy with tax increases? You can't.
That is
It's economics. You can't have both. I mean, if you need that much stimulus, it's hard to raise taxes. Would you agree?
I agree. Like I said, we'll talk a little bit about some of the nuance in that.
Yeah.
Some of what's being discussed by Biden himself as a candidate and others is kind of a way they would target that. And they've got a fairly specific plan out there. Again, it doesn't mean it would get passed because it's his plan, not the broader Democratic plan.
Right.
But again, just across the board tax increase. A lot of the states are seeing this. States have to have a balanced budget and they can't issue debt. And you're seeing this real conundrum in a lot of states that are. So I don't know. They may just say we have to, and we'll see what happens. We'll hope the economy.
Later, I want to ask you from a bond guy's perspective on interest rates.
Right. I agree. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, sure.
So again, I think we can stop for a second and talk. There's a couple of questions coming through that I will probably defer if that's okay, because we're going to hit exactly on them. And actually, we're about to hit them just here in the next line. And there is one question that what's the likelihood of any additional stimulus will be passed by the election? I used to say it was about 80%. I'm down to about 40%. I just think it's going to be tough to get anything passed because there's so much disagreement. And as we were saying, the things that seem to have the most, most emergency feel to them, for example, like the additional unemployment payments, they don't agree on that either. So I think right now, I think it's unlikely that much will happen. And something little may be tacked on to, again, a continuing resolution, but that's about it. So they could do something in after the election during the lame duck session, but again, we'll wait to see what the dynamic is after that.
Sure.
So let's move on to the presidential election and go answer a couple of questions that came up that we can talk about. So again, we know that we have two candidates now, right? And that's official as of about 3 weeks ago. We have both are the official nominees of their party. President Trump had a pretty direct route. Obviously, Biden had a much rockier path. When I was giving these speeches back in December and January, there was a lot of discussion about all those 24 names, those faces on the left there that were part of that group. But it was interesting, I think it's an interesting story, and this answers one of the questions that was asked, is that Biden, as you can see, that he's the green line here across the top. He was the leader. He was the front runner, all the way back to the beginning of 2019, viewed as the person that was most likely to be the nominee, the moderate candidate, the kind of return to the old Obama days, just sort of comfort and back to normal is kind of what everyone was kind of feeling why he was the leading candidate. But then, as one of the questioners just asked, in Iowa and New Hampshire, he just did awful. And he didn't campaign well. He didn't come across well. He was 4th and 5th in those two. And he was basically left for dead from a campaign standpoint. Bleeding in, he had always said South Carolina's going to save him, Nevada's going to help. But it was looking very bleak. They were out of money. They're basically a bankrupt campaign. And they had basically, at this point, they had been viewed, my colleagues, and I have a colleague in New Hampshire that went to several events where nobody was talking to Biden or Joe Biden at these events, where normally they would be swamped because they were all talking to Pete Buttigieg and Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, and he was just viewed as a non-factor. And really what happened, and again, I've had this confirmed by several members, is that this is still a party that's very much controlled by President Obama's presence and his team and all the people that still work in his circle. And they said he got very directly involved. I'm not saying he made personal calls, but it was very shocking that right before Super Tuesday, and right around the time of the South Carolina primary, that Amy Klobuchar and Pete Buttigieg, they all dropped out and they endorsed Biden. At the same time, getting Chairman Clyburn, very influential, Black congressman, to also endorse him very strongly going into South Carolina, is what pushed him up all of a sudden. And the main reason was, and not to offend any Bernie Sanders fans on the calls, but they did not want Bernie Sanders as their standard bearer. I had several Democrats say I'd rather saw off my right arm than have Bernie Sanders be our standard bearer. The belief was he would not win the White House and he would hurt their ability to hold the House. They wouldn't get the Senate back, and even state races. Texas Democrats were worried about Bernie Sanders being the lead, in the presidential race. So the fact that they could not have Sanders there, they had to rally around who it was going to be. Obama had never come out and endorsed anyone. It would have been obvious for him to endorse Biden from the onset, but he wanted to see if someone else would take hold and get traction. And when they did it, they finally said, we've got to throw the grenade and we got to get him here. And obviously it worked. And now, he is doing great cash-wise, and he did garner all the support, and he was able to become the nominee, and Sanders eventually had to drop out. But it's an interesting case. There's not many situations where you've seen an election end up like this, on one part or the other, where someone is left so far behind and then zooms back to the top. And part of the concern too is that, again, if you look back all the way back to 1984, when the establishment Democrat is put up as the nominee, the one that was the front runner, they tended to lose. All the way back to Mondale and Dukakis and all those through here. It was really the insurgents, President Obama, Clinton, and Carter, that weren't expected to be the nominee from the outset, that had the energy to win. Doesn't mean it's going to change. Again, in President Trump's presence, I think changes all of this calculus, and that may. This is a little bit about energy, but what's there. Again, we know that this is the Democratic ticket now, and Biden is still not necessarily running a very robust campaign. You have Trump still holding these big rallies and planning to hold a lot more of these rallies, and you have Biden doing these little quiet things here and there. And there's a lot of criticism of his ability, and a lot of people are saying, they were saying 2 years ago he's lost a step, and so, those are issues that are here, but it's coming down more to just how everyone feels about President Trump himself, and he's been underwater the entire time. His entire presidency, he has had a lower approval rating and, less than 50%. He had actually gotten to a really good point right before COVID hit. It was actually the high point of his presidency as far as approval and polling and all those things. And COVID and then the protests both just really tanked his approval. It's starting to come back to some degree, but this is what's interesting. And so you talk about the enthusiasm gap. Trump has a definite advantage here. And typically, if you look back really about the last 10 presidential elections, whoever wins this wins the race. And so if you looked only at this, you would say, okay, Trump's going to win because he's got a significant enthusiasm gap. Again, Democrats are basically saying, yeah, he's our candidate. We don't love him, but he's our candidate. But the point is, he's not Trump. And that's where, again, a lot of this comes up, because it flips when you say, why are you voting Democrat? Why are you voting for Biden? About 60% of his supporters say it's because he's not Trump. And they were basically saying we would have voted for pretty much anyone who was in that slot because we want to beat Trump. And there's a much lower number. That's one thing Republicans worry a bit about is that 4 years ago, Hillary Clinton was hated. Not only were people fairly enthusiastic about Trump, but they could not stand Hillary Clinton. That sort of despising Biden is not there right now. So they may not be fans of him, or they may not feel like he'd be a good president, but they don't feel as strongly negatively about him as the polls show they felt about Hillary Clinton. So again, this is another situation where the presence of Trump may kind of change the calculus. It may not, though, because again, this is an indicator of who gets out to vote. That's what more than it is anything is, are you enthusiastic enough to go vote? And right now, I think it's the positive people that support Trump, and on the Democratic side, it's the positive. We want to get rid of Trump, and there's going to be some impetus there to get to the polls as well. So that will be this enthusiasm is an interesting thing to watch. And again, this is just where the actual election is looking. This is just a national polls, and as you see, it's narrowing a little bit. Biden. The thing about this always, again, this is popular vote. It really is not all that meaningful. I have it on here because you should watch it. And it really is not that different from where it was at this point in the Clinton Trump election, is that Clinton had about a 6 to 7 point lead as well. Sometimes it was a little bit lower. But the fact is, this includes California, New York, Illinois, states that they're going to swamp with votes. And there's a cap because of the Electoral College. And when you think about it, Hillary Clinton won the popular vote by 2.8 million votes, but she won California alone by 4.5 million. So the entire margin of victory was almost doubled by California, throwing New York, Illinois, other places. So again, this is not a good indicator. And again, what's interesting, I throw the betting odds just because it's just kind of like public sentiment. People are putting their real money down, and you can see it. It was even during the pandemic, Trump was still ahead in the betting odds. It was basically when George Floyd was killed that this all changed. And immediately his response, how he handled it, he fell off the map, both in public sentiment and in the betting odds. And it's just now that he's come back and kind of made it an interesting race again from the pure betting. But they're not always right. They believed that Hillary Clinton would win. She was ahead in the betting odds in 2016. So again, what's influenced the race? I'm kind of going to dash through these quickly because we kind of know all this. This is an interesting chart to me just because it shows Obama in the blue and Trump in the red. If you go back and index to the day they were inaugurated, how the market's done ever since. And a lot of, Trump brags about his markets and about what he's done in the stock market, and he obviously record levels that we've had, recently. But when you look at it, on a pure, index basis, Obama had a better record than Trump did. When you look at what happened to the stock market, and again, Obama had the benefit of jumping in, during the financial crisis and having a pretty low margin to start from. But and Trump, inherited a pretty healthy market. But it is, interesting that this is something that was, something he still pushes, but it has less cachet these days. And Democrats have been successful at saying stock markets don't matter for the common person, even though you could argue that they do. But it's one of those things where that's one of the things that won a little bit. Again, unemployment, the fact that it's coming down rapidly is definitely good for Trump. That's what he wants. That's why you're not hearing Democrats talk much about the fact it was moving down. Of course, he was very proud 3.5% rate that he had going into COVID. And again, but studies show if it gets down below 8%, there's a bunch of voters that kind of tend more toward Trump because he's seen as a little bit stronger on the economy. When it comes down to it, again, every poll I've seen, there's only about 6% of voters who are not decided yet. So we're not talking about a lot of people that are going to, that are going to have their minds changed or waffling between the two candidates. But it does again mean who comes out to vote, and that is the key to this: is who actually gets out there and votes. Again, the Republicans love President Trump because of what he's done with the judges and the justices, and about I think a quarter of all of the current circuit judges right now in the federal have been appointed by Trump. He's been a blistering fix, and the Senate Republicans have been very supportive of him, moving very quickly, and they're continuing. I mean, they're still cranking out, new judges and district court and appeals court judges, even as we speak, and they're going to, keep trying as long as they can. Again, Trump fatigue is a huge thing. It's hard to measure. It's one of those things right now that Democrats are playing this up big. You think about it. There's been a bad story about once a week these days, and I think there will be a bad story probably once a week going forward. I think it's a fairly coordinated effort. But first, it was the Atlantic story about calling veterans losers, and then this week it is Bob Woodward saying that he told him that he knew it was bad and he wasn't. He was lying to the American people. I mean, there's just constant thing that doesn't really change most Trump voters. They're not going to change their mind because of these things that are coming out. They know President Trump is not probably the best quality person when it comes down to the kind of person you want to hang out with all the time. But they also don't believe that will make him jump onto a Democratic philosophy of how they want the country to be run. So this is meant to try to suppress voter turnout. The more we can get out, just at some point there are some people, it's like, I am a Republican, but I just can't stand to take 4 more years of this. Too much chaos. I'm just not going to go vote.
Sure.
And that's part of what they're trying to push here. So again, hard to measure, but I think it's a real factor. And that's one thing the Democrats are trying to push right now. Again, right now, President Trump's big push is focusing on violence over virus. The coronavirus is not necessarily a winning hand for him. You can argue whether or not it's his fault or things are worse or better because he was president. But what he can't talk about are a lot of how some of these protests have turned into riots, and how a lot of these democratically controlled cities are, in his view, having trouble, and suburbs are in danger because all this looting is going to come out to them. And I think there is a convincing argument for some. Again, it goes back to trying to impact voter turnout. And of course, you're going to see Biden continue to talk about his character and talk about coronavirus, because again, they believe that is a winning hand they have as well. And again, the Bob Woodward story this week is another example of how they try to reinforce that. This is one thing that's very important to focus. When we talked about how national polls don't make a lot of difference, this is one that really is what Trump should be paying attention to, and is paying attention to. So the deep red here doesn't mean Republican. Red means how negative is the approval rating. How much do we despise President Trump? If so, California is not surprising. California, Washington, Oregon are all states that are deep red here, that because again, there's a significant negative vote. But what should worry Trump is that Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania are all kind of pink on these charts. That shows that even in these states that he won, that he has a negative approval rating. And again, this is why he won the presidency. People, were aware of it at the time, but these 3 states, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, that had voted Democratic, all the way back to 1992, barely went to the Republican side by 44,000, again, less than 1% in some cases, which is why there were so many recounts, if you recall, because they were, just dying for one of these to get flipped back the other way. But when you studied it, actually it was one county in each. If one county in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Michigan had changed to Hillary Clinton, you'd have Hillary Clinton as president right now. I mean, that's how close this was. Even though the overall total looked more comfortable, this is how close it was. And he has to win 2 of these 3 states. He has to keep the states that he won last time, including Arizona and Florida and North Carolina, but he has to win 2 of these 3 states if he wants to, or pick up another one that he didn't have next time. So this is what we're watching. This is where I'm really going to be focused. And he's not doing great in all 3 of those. Again, if you believe the polls, but again, polling going into last time also showed him being behind in these states. Again, it's important to remember this. This is 2 weeks before the election in 2016. And according to this map, Hillary Clinton was going to win, and she was going to win Arizona, she was going to win Florida, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan. All of those states ended up being red. So again, just 2 weeks out, if you looked at, again, what your expectations were, and this was, again, some of those were tied leads by the Democrats, but the belief was that it would be Hillary Clinton going away. And again, because he was successful doing that, then that's what, why he ended up winning. And again, what's important to note though is also Arizona is tending to get bluer and bluer. So Arizona may be harder for him to keep. And even if he can win Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, if he loses Arizona, there's some hope he may get Minnesota right now. It's part of his violence message is that Minnesota is trending back to be a toss-up because what happened in Minneapolis. So again, these are the things that are interesting to watch, but it's those three Midwestern states that are going to be key. But some of these others, he still has to win, and that's where polling is hard, and the pollsters will tell you. And I've had multiple conversations with Gallup and Rasmussen and others, and they have to make 1,000 calls to get one answer sometimes. I mean, they send these robo things out, and they just hope somebody picks up. When they pick up, it's like, please stay on the phone and take this survey. But all of us, it has to be cell phone, and some of it's online, and it's just very hard to know they're getting representative samples in all this because they tend to wait and re-wait, once they get the information. The other key issue we're going to talk about, not a lot, but just mail-in voting is going to be a big issue. And the key here, I'm not going to go so far as what President Trump's saying is just going to be riddled with corruption and vote rigging. But it is a problem because if you look, the entire eastern half of the country is not used to voting by mail. And they've tried and they're working on it. And like New York, for example, they had their primary on June 28th, and it was 2 full months before they knew a couple of the primary races had gone. Those were just congressional districts. So, they didn't know who was going to be the winner of a primary in a congressional district for almost 2 full months because of just the sheer weight of how many mail-in ballots there were. And you have to check signatures. It's a very laborious process. And the concern is, again, if there's just this huge number, I don't think New York's going to be questionable whether or not it's red or blue. But what about North Carolina, which is also seeing a huge inflow and expecting a lot more? What if that one's held up by 6 weeks? We really could go for a while without knowing who the president is, into mid-December, if we don't, if some of these things aren't fixed. But again, it's hard to fix it within 2 months. You can't institute. I mean, Colorado, Utah, Oregon, Washington, they do a great job because they've been doing it for decades. They've been working on it. They have the infrastructure. Everyone knows how to do it. There's no question. If you talk to someone from Colorado, it's like, this is a no-brainer. It's so easy to vote by mail. But it's because they have the infrastructure and everybody else doesn't. Texas just had a whole piece, a wrench thrown into ours here in Texas when a judge just ruled that if they're going to look at a signature and it doesn't match, typically they would just discard it. This vote doesn't count because the signature doesn't match. Well, judge just ruled that they're going to have to allow that to be cured. And right now, October 23rd is the date that, the last date you can request a ballot. So ballots are coming in on November 2nd or 3rd, and they don't have the right, and if someone has the ability to go back and cure it, what does that raise? So there could be lots of states that are dealing with these issues because of the sheer number of votes that are happening. This is going to be interesting. The courts are going to weigh in at some point, sure. I think, because like they did, during the Al Gore Bush election, just because at some point you've got to know who the president's going to be. So let's pause for a minute, see if there's other questions that have come up.
So feel free to put questions in. If you have, we'll get to them as we go along here. And I think that there's a question about the bond market. All this. I know we're going to talk about control of Congress. I know a lot of people are interested in that, but tie this back to the financial markets. Put your portfolio hat back on.
Yeah, a lot of that's always sort of a Uri and Timmer question, with Infidelity, not me. But no, I think I'm very troubled. I'm on some boards. I'm on a board at my alma mater, Abilene Christian. I'm on their endowment board, and they have a pretty significant endowment. And I'm arguing, for a little bit more, hedging on the money side, either gold or cryptocurrency or something that lets them, something that's going to offset to some degree just the sheer amount of money that's in the system. That's going to be in the system for a long time. And
so that's an inflation trade.
Inflation trade to some degree. And the other piece is interest rates. I do think they're going to have to stay low. I mean, and the Fed came out, recently and said that they're going to focus less on inflation and more about unemployment. But even if unemployment gets down, to a significantly low number, I think, the country can't afford higher interest rates right now. When we have, over 100% of our GDP in debt, it is going to be the number one line item in the budget. And at some point, there has to be some level of equilibrium formed. And I don't know how it's going to happen. It's going to take some leadership by somebody. But as far as the markets themselves, I think interest rates are low. as far as I can see. And
that's an important fact.
Yeah.
I want you, your bond guy wants you to report that, repeat that, because you can't have this level of debt in the system and drag on the economy without low interest rates, right? I mean, you're trying to create inflation in every way you can, but it hasn't been easy.
And that could just be it, is that inflation is not going to be a factor. But that will be the conundrum if inflation starts somehow, emerging, and the Fed is concerned about what do we, we've lost all of our tools, as the Fed. We've done everything. We've blown our whole wad on this. So what can we do? What's left? And that's what's going to be interesting to watch through all this.
I think the one other question I was asking along those lines, I know you're a bond guy, but I had a conversation with a portfolio manager this week of talking about, and I haven't fact checked this yet, but he was talking about Warren Buffett saying that multiples can be supported at this level. He basically was taking the equity market and stripping away the technology stocks that have been leading the equity market, and said that, the rest of the market is actually trading at a fairly reasonable multiple considering where interest rates are. Maybe.
Right, yeah, I think that's true. Yeah, I do agree that's true.
Yeah, and I'm not trying to be bold up on stocks, but it's just a different perspective.
I don't think it's an argument to make some drastic change. Honestly, I don't. I wouldn't be advocating for someone just to completely overhaul their portfolios. But I do think implementing a little bit of a hedge against inflation, perhaps for the future. Again, worried about money supply and stability of that is one thing to think about. But I wouldn't be adding tons of bonds either right now. It's just not. I just think. I mean, you're not going to get, yeah, exactly. You're not going to get any current return, and you're not going to get a lot of appreciation because they're just down so low already. So.
Okay, I didn't want to take you off course. I know we're fine. Let's talk about Congress, and then we'll take some questions.
Yeah. I was just going to ask one of these questions right up here from one of our viewers.
Sure.
Scott, one of our viewers wanted to know about the Biden tax plan.
Yeah.
And he wanted you to kind of contrast that with the prior Republican tax plan.
Right.
And how that brought bigger deficits.
Right. Yeah, I can just jump into Biden's plan right now. I mean, he is proposing. Well, actually, let's go through a couple of things. I'll get to that because it's kind of what's going to be on the Democratic agenda here.
Sure. Okay.
Just a couple of slides. So, so the House, again, I will say from the House standpoint, I don't think the House is going to flip back red. The Republicans need 18 seats. They're just not doing that well in some of these toss-ups. There are 28 toss-ups, so they have to kind of not only win all their current ones, which is up for question. I actually, up the Dallas area, I sit in one of these. I sit in Texas 24, which is previously Kenny Marchant. It's a toss-up. You have a very conservative Republican, a very progressive Democrat running, and one of those two is going to win. But again, Republicans would have to run the table. It doesn't seem like it's going to happen. Even in some places like in Oklahoma with Kendra Horn, again, someone on this call probably knows even more direct than I do. But that is not, that should be a race that should go back to Republican way. And right now, it doesn't seem to be, a clear indication it's going to happen. So I would have said 2 or 3 weeks or several weeks ago, in the middle of all the protests, it really looks bad for Republicans. The pendulum's swinging back a little bit, and so I think there's probably some hope. But I just think it's going to probably stay about the same where it is. So expect to see the House remain in Democratic hands. Republicans really are trying to keep the Senate. That's probably the most important thing they can do right now. And it is, even though they're ahead, and even though they just have so many seats to defend, and you think about it, Democrats need 4 seats to get the outright majority. You could say at 50-50 with President Biden and with Vice President Harris breaking the tie, they'd still have the quote-unquote majority. But they really need 4 seats to have an outright majority. Their biggest problem is they're going to lose Alabama for sure. I mean, Doug Jones is not going to win Alabama against Tommy Tuberville, the former coach of Auburn. And so that one goes back to the Republican candidates. So now they need 5 seats, but they have a lot of options. They have a lot of possibilities here. And this kind of goes in order. Martha McSally is really doing poorly against Mark Kelly there, former astronaut married to Gabby Giffords. He is a very likable, kind of mainstream, kind of moderate Democrat on most issues. Cory Gardner, same thing. He's a good, solid Republican senator that's done some good work, but he's in a state that's getting bluer and bluer, and up against John Hickenlooper. Susan Collins is in more trouble than she's ever been, up against the Sarah Gideon up there, who is the Speaker of the House, the State House in Maine, and a pretty popular politician. And really, Collins got hit so hard by voting for Kavanaugh to be Supreme Court justice and not to remove Trump in a pretty blue state. So, there's trouble there. North Carolina, Tillis, for whatever reason, has never been very popular. He's behind the polls against his Democratic, tight, within the margin of error. But again, he is not doing that well either. So and typically, historically, and this will be interesting to watch, whoever wins the state, president-wise, if there's a toss-up, that's the same way the Senate seat goes too. So in this case, I think if Trump wins North Carolina, Tillis probably wins. And if Biden wins North Carolina, then Cunningham, who is the opponent, probably wins. So those are the interesting things to watch. Only thing I'll add on this, which I think could be fascinating, and just kind of for a little nerd like me on politics, but Georgia has 2 seats, right? So both Senate seats are up for grabs because Purdue is up just by the nature of its term. Kelly Loeffler was put in place and she was appointed to an open seat. And that's going to be a jungle primary. So if you're a Georgia resident, you're going to go in and vote for Purdue versus the opponent there. For just a straight up. On the other one, there's going to be 6 or 7 candidates. They're both Republicans and Democrats, both on everyone's ballot, and you're going to vote for who you want. And there's not going to be a clear winner, and there will be a runoff that doesn't happen until January. So what if it's 50-49, and we're waiting on this last Georgia seat to be decided if it's Republican or Democrat? I can't imagine how much money, how many hundreds of millions of dollars we poured into that state trying to get every, they'll basically have an Uber for every single person trying to make sure they get to the polls. So it's going to be fascinating to watch when all this happens. But it's so key for Democrats to be able to take back the House, the Senate, for them to be able to do what they want to do. And that's the key to the whole story is what is. And again, the other piece of it is what happens to the filibuster. And the Senate tends to be more bipartisan. It has to be more collaborative because you have to have 60 votes to pass almost everything. But there's a big push these days to get rid of the filibuster. It's not in the Constitution. It's been there since 1807 in some form or fashion. But as you can see by this chart, it was hardly ever used until kind of the 70s, 80s, and now it's used all the time. It's just a constant use. And both parties do it. Both parties, if they are in the minority, but they have, there's fewer than 60 seats in the majority, they use this tool all the time. And the question is, will they get rid of it? And I think if they ran the table and got all of those seats, all those toss-ups, and they had 55 seats, you might see Democrats vote to end the filibuster. And that's when you really would see a lot of big changes happen. And even without that, change can happen. But the question will be, can they win, period? And that's not a given. They have to win several of these key states, key races. But if they do take back the Senate, what is that majority? Because there are some like Cunningham in North Carolina, Democrat, if I win, I would not get rid of the filibuster.
So this sounds like to me that the Scott Orr betting poll is that, maybe the election's a toss-up right now. I'm not trying to pin you down on that. But the balance of power is a pretty high probability of remaining in the House and the Senate, would you say?
I think it's 50-50 on the Senate right now. I think the Senate could flip to Democratic, especially if Joe Biden wins. Again, I think that's going to have that's going to have kind of a joint effect in there. So I think if Biden wins, I think it's pretty likely the Senate is maybe by a seat, but I think it's like 1 seat. I think it's 51-49, which again I think means the filibuster is still safe because I don't think Joe Manchin, I don't think Kirsten Sinema, I don't think several of the more bipartisan senators are not going to vote to get rid of the filibuster because it does really change things dramatically. Because here is kind of this is what they've said they want to do. And I will say this, number one, doesn't matter if they have the filibuster or not. So you recall that the Republicans were able to pass the Tax Cut Act without any Democratic votes, and because there's a process called reconciliation that I won't get into the weeds on that, but there's a process where you can use a certain technique to pass something in the Senate that can't be touched by the filibuster. So they could do all of these things potentially in a bill with only 51 votes in the Senate. So they want to absolutely, again, this is a pretty united thing. When I said, Democrats are not always at odds, they all agree on this because they hate the Tax Cut Act. So because none of them voted for it. So raising corporate income taxes, you expect to see that rate go up, and that's in Biden's plan. So the rates would go back up there. Raise taxes on higher earners, and what Biden is proposing is 400,000. So if you make more than 400,000, then your rates would go back up to kind of 39.6, and maybe even more in some situations, and lots of other ancillary things, reductions and deductions, and just all kinds of things. And they would, talk about, again, if you have over $1 million, you're saying there would be, no more capital gain benefit.
So I got to ask about this. How do you do this in this economy? You got it. You cannot do it all at once. It would be political suicide. You would crush the economy. Yes.
That's what a Republican would say, honestly. I mean,
Yeah, actually,
but no, an economist would say, no, I'm not saying as a Republican.
From an economist standpoint.
I think you find economists will say that doing this to the top would not hurt the economy. There are some economists that will say that, and that's what they are hanging their hats on. But they just want to unwind that, and they see a deficit, and they see all these problems. One of the things we can do is raise $4 trillion, are raising taxes on people that make 400,000, and it's a pretty significant increase when you look at it. It's a lot of not only the individual rates, but again, step up all the issues with the estate tax. And again, this is just Biden's plan. And if Democrats, have their way, there'll be other things that are in there, and it may not be 400,000. They may bring it down a little bit.
But does it raise $4 trillion over what time period?
About 10-year time period.
Okay. What about when you spend $4 trillion more on
no, that's the whole point. It's not. They're not going to stop spending. Yeah. It is not. Absolutely, it's not going to balance the budget.
This is an economics question, because I think we talked earlier. It had to do with if our there's a lot of fear around this. This is why I'm trying to get to it. Raising the capital gains tax seems like it's Stymie's investment. A lot of people are worried about capital gains tax. And a lot of people, there's questions that we get about, should I take my money out of the market, which this happens around every election. Should I take my money out of the market and wait till all this happens and then get back in? Markets anticipate it in my history. And but your situation with taxes just seems to be, I'm strictly talking about it from an economic standpoint.
Yeah.
It just seems hard to implement. I think it sounds good during campaigns, but it seems almost impossible to implement in this economy.
I would bet if they have the House, the Senate, and even again a 51-seat majority in the Senate and President Biden, I think they'll pass this. They'll pass this in early next year. By the summer they would pass it, and I'm sure it'll be retroactive too. Again, they'll typically pass things. So the key is if you make over a certain amount, that's what it's going to be about. It doesn't get rid of the capital gains differential unless you make, I think, over $1 million a year is what he's proposing right now. But that will probably come down.
What about how about the estate tax? Is it relevant?
I think that is not in Biden's plan right now, I don't believe, but I think Democrats also. So I think the level of
it's kind of a heat-seeking missile politically. It doesn't raise that much money.
That's right.
But it's just a heat-seeking missile.
And again, and the basis step up is another thing that's talked about a lot. Is like, why is that there? And again, from those that feel like the wealthy don't pay enough, that's kind of one of the things that's a big target. And again, limiting the salt deduction tap again is another thing that for some Californians especially might ease the blow a little bit of higher rates if they can deduct their full tax burden.
Where do you think corporate income tax rates would end up in Biden's plan?
It's not all the way to 35. I think he goes to 29.6 or something like that. I have to go back and look at the exact number. So it's not all the way back to 35 where it was, but it's raising the rate for sure. And then it's also adding on some things internationally. A lot of what the Tax Act did was, I don't know all the details. They talked about bringing money back from offshore and all that kind of stuff. It would also put some additional costs on that as well. So I would argue it would have a negative economic benefit, impact. It would be definitely, the Tax Cut Act did help the economy. I think, anyone will say that happened. So there's going to be some reversal of that. And it's probably even less about individuals and more about corporate tax.
Truthfully, you have to pay for all of this somehow. So there has to be some reversal. You can't keep kicking it down the road, right? Some would say. But it just seems, I won't have any money left to pay for a steak dinner, but I would almost bet a steak dinner that they can implement it quickly. From an economic standpoint.
I do think there will be some pushback, and there could be some inter-party pushback that limits how much they do. But I do think there are key things they want to unwind pretty quickly, and I think Democrats will be pretty unified on that. Again, this list is going to be either horrifying or exhilarating based on your point of view when you look at it. So DACA immigration reform, absolutely on the table. Again, that's another one that almost all Democrats agree on. So if they have full control, this would be subject to the filibuster again, so they would have to to either, get rid of the filibuster or find a way to make some Senate Republicans happy. Healthcare reform, again, high on the list of trying to get back and broaden who gets healthcare. Social justice, all the protests, all the things that there is gonna be a response to that. And there could be some bipartisanship here, but again, it's something that Democrats are gonna push. Climate change, absolutely. Talks about the energy, you mentioned the energy industry. This is where I think Democrats would be a negative on energy, because again, Joe Biden and pretty much across the board, even the more conservative, moderate Democrats are more likely to say, what can we do to limit fossil fuels going forward? And it's not so far as the Green New Deal. I don't think that it's going to pass, but there will be elements of things that will continue to, environmental and regulatory, that would impact fossil fuels.
But a point, just one point of clarification I want to say before we go on, because we talked about this earlier, 200-year plus, system of balance of power. I don't believe whoever wins the election, the president, I don't believe the president really shapes the financial markets so much.
For the most part, right.
And what you're talking about is a difficult scenario where there's a full majority in the House and the Senate and the president, where some of these things might be able to get passed
and everything passed the Tax Cut Act. All of this would, for it to be a dramatic change, you would have to be them getting rid of the filibuster in the Senate. Because again, that 60 vote margin is always going to be Republicans. If they're in the minority, are always going to block a lot of these things or elements of these things.
Sure.
So again, there may be enough will to say, can we, woo 7 or 8 Republicans with a certain kind of a more modified plan along these lines, and that remains to be seen. Again, wealth cap, again, you're not even, what we talked about on rates, but raising minimum wage, unemployment reform, mandates for, federal mandates for, family leave, all that kind of stuff would be a potential. Re-regulating the financial industry, I think we worry about that more than maybe some people on the call do, but, just our ability to talk to our clients and how we work with, the fiduciary rule that was put in place by President Obama that was reversed by the courts. I think that comes right back. And again, that's a regulatory issue probably. And gun control will absolutely be a key discussion. And it depends on how far along that goes. Some of it would be regulatory executive orders, but if Congress could pass something on those lines, education policy, again, free college student loan debt forgiveness, those are all things that a majority of Democrats want in the House, even those that are more moderate. The long-term advantages, just really quickly, they can't abolish the Electoral College, but they can start that process if they choose to. If they can pass the kind of the beginning of the constitutional amendment that would get rid of the Electoral College, it would have to be passed by 75% of states. That won't happen, I don't believe. But again, Democrats are these days not big fans of Electoral College. And if Trump wins again, they will really not be fans, but that'd be put off. Statehood is another huge one too. Statehood for DC and PR. That Puerto Rico, people don't realize that Congress can pass just by majority to add a state. Yeah. And DC would add 2 senators that would be Democrats for sure. If Puerto Rico was a state, that's 2 more senators that would be Democrats for sure at this point. That's 4 seats that they're thinking about. And it's almost that brazen, saying we need more senators, we need the ability to have more Democratic senators and kind of reinforce our majority. And those are things that could happen. They could pass that. Again, they'd have to have the no filibuster, but that could absolutely happen as well.
So this has been great, Scott.
Yeah.
And we've run a little bit over, a lot of great information. Yeah. And I think appreciate everybody for staying with us. We've had a nice sized group today. Let's take a few questions. Anybody who wants to get a question in, you can type a question in. We'll try to get to it here in the last few minutes before we wrap up. And sorry, we've gone a little over today, but it's just been a fascinating.
I always talk too much, yeah, sorry.
So while we're waiting for a few questions to come in, we got a few in the queue right now. Mm-hmm. If you were to wrap up and summarize it, everything now, you've studied this stuff. I mean, what are kind of your 3 takeaways from all this?
I mean, I think even though we're within around 60 days from the election or so, I still think it's a toss-up. I still think the president, it can go either way. I think a lot's going to happen still between now and November that's going to impact it. Although, again, the debates are going to be huge. It's going to be how they go. I think right now the expectation is that Biden will be terrible in debate and will not handle it well. But again, if they go far enough along and set low expectations, and he does okay, then that may not have that big of an impact. But Republicans are hanging their hats on the debates and how Trump can really just, gain some momentum. And he is the master of the cycle. And one of my colleagues, Shahira and I worked for him for several years in the White House. She was at Fidelity. She did a lot of these, 5 years ago. And even though she wasn't a big Trump fan herself, she was hired in and she was actually the one that got the tax cut bill passed. I mean, she was the liaison between Congress. But she said, I would sit in these meetings and we would all be glum because Trump was in the toilet when it came to approval ratings, and this is midterm, and he was just like, folks, it's all a cycle, and the lower you go, the higher you go. And so, in some ways, he doesn't mind probably, really hitting bottom about June, because that gives him, in his mind, the ability to do better going forward. So that's his goal, is to keep that pendulum moving in the right direction and for it to peak on November 3rd. And so again, that's why I think it's still a toss up. Again, I think the Senate goes with the president. I think if we have a Biden president, you have a Democratic Senate, barely. And I think if Trump wins, I think the Senate stays Republican, barely. And the key is, if there is some wave that develops and happens, and especially Republicans are completely overwhelmed and lose significant amounts of Senate seats, that's when things really could be much more dramatic. And the market's not pricing that in, and that's, I think there would be a negative market reaction for a while if that happened, because
Sure.
there would be this realization that lots of things can happen, and so that's what's going to be key. If it's on the edge, I think less happens.
All right, we'll grab a couple of questions real quick as we wrap up. Anything you want to talk about? General statements you hear about Democratic versus Republican markets. I mean, it looks like, certainly during the Obama era, we were coming out of the financial crisis, so you had this long move. And I kind of get back to this and then there's talk about the Trump market doing well. I mean, what's the history? Is it relevant?
Everything I read is that it is fairly balanced. That it really doesn't matter if Democrat or Republicans in. I mean, that's definitely the situation. And I remember back, in the Clinton years when he was raising rates, and everyone thought, the economy is going to just get killed, we're going to be awful. Well, that was the only time we've had a balanced budget, even a budget surplus, in the last 60 years. And so it really was beneficial. And as soon as George Bush got in, he, did the tax cut, and then we got rid of that deficit. I mean, we got rid of that surplus right away. So I do think there is dubious argument when you talk about, tax cuts just, making the economy just take off, and that pays for the tax cuts. It just didn't happen this time.
Right.
And so that's why I also the opposite is not exactly true every time either. Sometimes if they do it correctly, the tax increases don't hurt the economy or don't at least send it to the tank, and it does raise significant revenues. So, but they don't want to raise to get rid of the deficit. They want to raise revenues to spend more money.
Yeah.
That's definitely what's in Biden's head.
And my view is, as always, it's kind of the James Carville quote. I mean, it's the economy's stupid, right?
Yeah.
And I love that quote because it was during Clinton's campaign. It was to me, I think you focus on what's happening in the economy.
Right.
And that's the direction the markets are going to go, and who the president is gets curtailed to some degree by checks and balances.
Checks and balances are absolutely there, but there are things they can do regulatory wise. That's both Obama and Trump have been very active on the executive orders and regulations, and there's an issue that if you did again have a majority, even a bare majority in the House and the Senate on the Democratic side, they could unwind about the almost last year's worth of regulatory activity that Trump did. There's a thing called congressional reconciliation. Is it congressional? CRA is what it stands for. But they are able to go in and actually overturn a prior president's a prior president's regulatory actions just out of hand. And the Republicans did that to Obama. They got rid of, I think, 30 or 40 of his regulations by congressional vote. Congressional Review Act is what it stands for. So that could also happen. So some of the things that Trump's doing right now, or even did back in February and March, environmental wise, things like that could all be unwound. Same thing on financial regulation. Yeah.
So another question about the Electoral College. I mean, some curtailment of the Electoral College to go, votes be cast for.
Yeah, I think it's just like, it's either way. I mean, I think there's no way that enough states are going to vote again, that there are states that have passed this thing that no matter how our state votes, that we will give our Electoral College votes to whoever wins the national popular vote. And that's a way around. That's a way that you get around the Electoral College because it changes the calculus there. But the same thing, just there's too many states that are either more Republican-led or are just smaller that, Wyoming's not about to give up its advantage. It has a significant advantage over California, for example, on what, a Wyoming's vote versus California's vote is something like 8 times bigger, just because of all the different ways that, how many congressmen and how many, even their 3 electoral college votes based on their population. So there's no way small states are going to give that up. And so I don't think enough of them vote for this, for that movement to happen either. I think the electoral college is here to stay. I really don't see any way that changes. And again, the pendulum can swing someday where Democrats like it. It's just what's true in all of this is that what's old is new again, right? And the pendulum swings.
And it swings too far in both directions.
Right? It swings, and 20, 30 years from now, electoral college could either be not a big deal or it could be Republicans that hate it. You just never know. But,
okay. So last couple things. Scott Orr's upside surprise in all of this, from your viewpoint, that you'd expect.
I'm not trying to put it in a partisan way, but from a pure market standpoint, I'm not going to lie that it's easier to work with the Republican administration when it comes to regulatory issues and things for the financial markets. And so, to me, the biggest positive for the markets would be the Senate staying Republican, no matter who's president. Honestly, I think that would probably be the biggest positive. And I think that's kind of 50-50, as I said. It's maybe a little harder to have a Biden president and a Republican Senate, but that can still happen. And I think that the Senate is the key to how much of this changes. And so I think the markets will respond favorably to a Biden presidency, even as long as you still had a Republican Senate.
And I gotta guess that as a bond guy, you're probably concerned. What are your biggest concerns? The deficit?
In the long run, yeah, the deficits and the amount of federal debt, absolutely, and what that's done to the money supply and reserves and all the things. Again, I still haven't heard one economist that can really just pinpoint all the different factors. You read 3 or 4, they all have different views on it. But yeah, I do think rates are low as far as the eye can see. It's just hard to imagine any scenario where you have enough inflation or whatever where the Fed feels good about raising rates again.
Good. Well, Scott, thanks for your time today. We appreciate you staying with us so long and being here. And thank you to all of our clients and friends who've joined us today. We'll continue to bring you, I think, good topics between now and the end of the year. We may revisit the election after the election to see what the outcome was. I know we're certainly late in the year going to revisit the economy and talk about the economy for the new year. But thanks again for joining us, and please feel free to reach out to us if you have additional questions that we didn't get to. We'll be glad to cover those with you personally. Thanks. Have a good weekend.
Thank you.